So last week we began this series looking at Psalm 139 and what it means to be known by God. We started by looking at verses 13 through 16 and remembering that God knows our design, that God created us, and that we are awesomely and wonderfully made. And this week, we're going to dig a little further into this idea that God knows us by going back to the beginning of Psalm 139, verses 1 through 5. And I invite us to read them together now from the Pew Bible. And again on page 444, the very bottom of the page, with the first 5 verses of Psalm 139. I invite us to read together. O Lord, you have searched me, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. Discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely. You hid me behind and before. You have laid your hands on me. Sixth verse. We're going to read it again another time. Yes, such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. This is the good news that God gives us. We give thanks for this good news that we are known by God. So this week's verses remind us that God is intimately aware of and involved in our lives. We are known and cherished. The psalmist here addresses God directly. In verse 1 and 4, in the Hebrew, it's Yahweh. In our purposes, it was translated Lord. And then 10 times in those first 5 verses, the psalmist directly addresses God as you. You have searched, you know, you perceive. And then it's not just one-sided, but the psalmist refers to himself 13 times. You have searched me and know me. When I sit down and when I rise, my thoughts, my ways, so on. All this you and me language reflects a deep personal relationship between God and the psalm writer. Walter Brueggemann describes this relationship saying, the Psalms are prayers addressed to a known, named, identifiable you. This is the most stunning and decisive figure in the prayers of the Psalm. We see that these are not prayers to an unknown God out there somewhere, but prayers to someone with whom the psalmist has a relationship. And then look again at the words of these verses. Forms of the word to know are also repeated frequently in this psalm. 3 times in the verses we just read, 4 more times in the remaining verses of the psalm. Because relationship implies knowing, right? That's why maybe you've been to a wedding shower, they play those games to see how well the partners know each other, see if they can get their answers right and how their partner would guess, answer random questions. And I was reminded in a TV show this week, if you're trying to prove that someone is who they say they are in relationship to another person, a good way is to ask really obscure questions. Only someone who really knows that person would know. Depth of relationship is characterized and measured by how well we know another. You may remember the Hebrew word of the root of the word to know is yada, which covers a whole range of meanings. I mean, in Genesis, we see Adam knew his wife Eve and they conceived a son. Elsewhere, God tells the people that they will know that I am the Lord, sense of understanding and believing. Job adds in 5:27, see, we have searched this out. It is true, hear and know it for yourself. Find knowing is something to be experienced. Some form of the word to know occurs 60 times throughout the Psalms. And it reminds us that this concept of knowledge is a critical element of meaningful relationship between God and God's people. We are to know God just as God knows us. This knowing often requires time and proximity. We often think of proximity as being close enough to share space, but as we have definitely learned over the last 3 years with modern technology, it's possible to know people quite well who you've never actually been in the same room with. that you shared digital space with. Even before Zoom and technology, you could get to know people through letters and phone calls. But there is still a sense in which knowing across a far distance is not the same. There are parts of our lives that it's just hard to share without literally rubbing shoulders, being in the same space, being part of the mundane of each other's lives. Why JB and I, after we had been dating for a year and a half, long distance, we decided we needed to live in the same town for a little while before we were ready to make that next step with each other for life. Physical presence, significant. That's why throughout the scriptures, we see God showing up to the Hebrew people in tangible ways again and again, like leading them through the desert with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. In Acts, the Holy Spirit is given to be with us always, and it's clear that this presence was felt by the disciples physically with their five senses. Remember the rushing wind, the flames of fire. It was a physical presence that they could feel. Of course, as Christians, we believe that most significantly, God showed up to us as Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, physically present on earth. And that meant that we could know God in a new way, but it also meant we realized in a new way how deeply God could know us. Some of y'all might be familiar with Koinonia Farm down in Georgia. I think Matt used to be part of this congregation, spent some time as an intern there. Well, Clarence Jordan, who co-founded that intentional community, an interracial community in the 1940s in southern Georgia, he once wrote about how as long as God was just an idea, an abstraction, a feeling, we were fine with God. But he says, when Jesus came in the flesh, he didn't like God around. It was a bad place for God to be. Sort of like having a preacher in the barber shop. Today, we might say something like having a preacher show up at the girls' weekend or the bachelor party. It felt uncomfortable having Jesus here in the everyday. So we, humanity, had to get rid of him. We nailed him to the cross and said, now you, God, you go back home where you belong with God, and we'll see you at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. As we said last week, as human beings, we often have both this deep, deep desire to be known so that we can find belonging and love, but we equally fear that being known will instead lead to rejection or require something of us we don't want to give. Eugene Peterson, in his Message translation of Psalm 139, writes the first 5 verses like this: God, investigate my life. Get all the facts firsthand. I'm an open book to you. Even from a distance, you know what I'm thinking. You know when I leave and when I get back. Never out of your sight. You know everything I'm going to say before I start the first sentence. I look behind me and you're there. Then up ahead and you're there too. Your reassuring presence, coming and going. I think it's a beautiful thing that Peterson describes as being known as and this constant presence as reassuring. And at the same time, I think probably not everyone feels the same way. Sometimes some of us can't imagine that our being known so deeply by God would be reassuring. You may be familiar with the Christian writer and novelist Anne Lamott. In her book, Traveling Mercies, she talks about her coming to faith, which was a long and winding road, beginning with experiences in childhood, and then she kind of talks about as going from really safe spaces of refuge that eventually led her to faith. And when she was about 30, she had this profound experience that I think in a lot of ways echoes what the psalmist describes in Psalm 139. This time in her life, everything was in disarray. She was drinking too much, drugging too much. She had lots of broken relationships. She felt, she says, unlovable, especially by God. Yet she still had these questions about God and about faith. She was drawn in by church music. There was a church that was near a flea market that she liked to go to on Sundays. And so as she was at the flea market, sometimes she would wander over to this church and just stand in the doorway, hear the beautiful gospel music. Eventually, after several months, she started taking a seat back, allowing herself to sing. She said she could sing better than she ever had in her whole life, surrounded by the music. And that somehow the singing wore down the boundaries and distinctions that kept her so isolated. But she always left before the sermon. She didn't want to be talked to about God. And so, even so, it seems that God was beginning to hem her in before and behind, nudging a healing hand, melting away what had become rigid and rotten within. And then on one particularly painful night, the night that she felt absolutely alone, she says she became aware that someone was with her, hunkered down in the corner. At first, she thought it was her deceased father. She had often felt his presence after he had died, when she was particularly feeling alone and sad. Yet the presence was so real, she actually flipped on the light switch just to make sure there wasn't actually someone standing in the corner, which of course there was not. She turned the light back off. After a while, she said she knew without a doubt it was Jesus with her there. And she was appalled. She thought about her life. She thought about what her brilliant progressive friends would think if she became a Christian. And so she turned away towards the wall and said out loud, "I would rather die." Yet still, he says, she felt him there, just sitting on his haunches in the corner of her sleeping loft, watching her with patience and love. And she squinched her eyes shut, but that didn't help because that's not what she was seeing him with. She fell asleep, and in the morning, the crouching presence was gone. Yet she still had this feeling, she says, of this presence following her. She describes it like a cat, persistently following her, wanting to be picked up and let in. And she knew, like a stray cat, if she did, this presence would stay. After a week of that, she went back to the church where she loved the music, and this time she stayed through the sermon, though she still thought that part was ridiculous. But there at the end, that last song, she says, was so deep and raw and pure that she could not escape. It was as if the people were singing in between the notes, weeping and joyful at the same time. She says, I felt like their voices, something was rocking me in its bosom, holding me like a scared kid, and I opened up to that feeling, and it washed over me. She goes on to say she left before the benediction, but as she raced home, she felt again this presence that she describes as a little cat chasing her, running along at her heels. And when she got home, she says she finally hung her head, and she uses more colorful language, but said, "Forget it, I quit." And she took a long, deep breath and said out loud, "All right, you can come in." She describes this as her first beautiful moment of conversion. After that, she began regularly attending this church where she had heard the singing, even sitting through the sermon, and she let the people there become family. Yet still, it was 2 years before she got sober. It was another year before she was ready to take that step of being baptized. There were no quick fixes, but she was finally assured that God was with her, and it was a reassuring presence. Now, not all of us have had such colorful or vivid experiences, but still, sometimes it is our fear of condemnation that keeps us from embracing or finding reassurance in God's presence. Maybe some of us can better relate to how spiritual writer and Jesuit priest Anthony de Mello writes, "I had a fairly good relationship with the Lord, but I always had this uncomfortable sense that he was looking at me and wanted me to look at him. But I would not, because I was afraid that I should find an accusation there or of some unrepented sin or a demand for something he wanted from me. Then one day, I looked. There was no accusation or demand. His eyes just said, 'I love you.'" Again, our stories, our experiences may not be like Anne Lamott's or even like Anthony de Mello's, but perhaps there has been, maybe still is, a part of us that feels the need to hold back. that questions if it is desirable or even possible to be known and deeply loved by God. Yet, like Anne's long and winding journey over many, many years, maybe we have experienced that even after we know the beauty of God with us, accept God's loving embrace of us, even after we let go, we are still at times beholden to things we wish we weren't. We still sometimes choose the wrong things, the things that harm us and those around us. As Paul writes at the end of Romans 7, sometimes we do not understand our own actions, for we do not do what we want, we do the very thing we do. We feel we cannot choose the good, try as we might. That we can find hope, that right after Paul describes this, at the end of chapter 7, Romans 8 begins by saying, that there is now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. This was the experience of the woman at the well. We can read about in John chapter 4. There in Samaria, Jesus encountered her, and as they got to know each other, as he spoke to her about who she was, and she came to recognize him for who he was, she no longer felt ashamed. Someone coming and saying, "Come see a man who told me everything I've ever done," would not sound like good news to many of us, maybe send us running in the opposite direction. But her experience of being known, the painful, even shameful parts and all, was not a source of shame or embarrassment, but was profoundly freeing. It was good news that compelled her to want to go and bring others to come experience for themselves what she had experienced in meeting Jesus. So in a moment, as we move into our reflection time, I want to invite you to think, what are the thoughts, the decisions, the actions, the desires that you most fear becoming known? Before we sing, I'm going to invite us to sit with those for a moment, to bring them before God. Imagine God looking at you, not with condemnation, but with eyes of love. This is the grace that compels us to follow. And like the woman at the well, to invite others to know this love, to know what it is to be known and embraced by love itself. Our reflection song this morning is "I've Decided to Follow Jesus." And of course, this following is something we choose. Yet at the same time, we are enabled to choose it only by God's grace. Letting God in, deciding to follow it, it is something that we continually choose. And even when we do turn back or doubt our decision, the good news of Psalm 139 is that God is with us still, there with patience and love. Because for Jesus, for God, there is no turning back on us. Thanks be to God.